Welcome to Investigating Genesis. So far, in the previous studies, we have said the following. Day 1. In the beginning, Elohim, the Creator God, created the heavens and the void dark earth. He also separated light from darkness. On day 2, the big task was really separation of water from water, above and below. And we explained what that meant. Day 3, separation of the dry ground, the land, and the water, the seas. He also created vegetation based on photosynthesis and plants with fruit according to their kind. And that was all done in preparation for future living things. Day 4, creation of the sun and the moon to govern the day and the night, provide seasons due to earthly tilt, and the earth is in the just right position relative to the sun, and he created the stars also. On day 5, creation of living things, Nepesh Kaya, with which the waters swarm, such as great sea creatures with amazing characteristics, as well as all kinds of creatures that fly in the air, also with exceptional abilities and attributes, from plankton to cetaceans and all fish in the sea, and up from bats to eagles to hummingbirds. And we looked at all that in quite some detail. So today we are looking at day 6. We are still in Genesis 1, of course, verses 24 to 25a. And God, and the word Elohim was used here, and God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to the kinds, livestock and creeping things, and beasts of the earth according to their kinds." And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. So day 6 is all about filling the land with life, and the kind is, of course, the different species. But each kind is reproducing according to its kind. I think that's an important thing to note, but we will get into that a little later. And of course, we know there's a tremendous variety of life on land and in the water and in the sea. But day 6 is all about the land creatures, because we've covered the flying creatures as well as those in the sea already. And we can see just from these few pictures the very big differences that we have in the animals. And you might say, well, what about the insects? They get no mention, really. Insects, although also creeping on the earth, are not really part of Nepesh Kaya, the Hebrew word there. Animals on the ark are described as basar, fleshy, in other words, only vertebrates, which have in them the spirit of life. And this excludes all insects, just by the word that is used in Hebrew. The Lord said he would destroy all flesh. That's also an important aspect just to remember for later in Genesis. It's also very interesting for a guy like me, if you research it a little bit, you can see that dinosaurs, or what we call dinosaurs, are known for quite a long time, because it would appear, if we look at Carlisle Cathedral, that there are some brass inlets in a sort of a gravestone that depicts animals that look very much like modern day pictures of dinosaurs, as you can see here at the bottom left. On a French chateau from 1500, we find an image like the one at top left, and it looks very much like a type of dinosaur. You would agree with me. Even more remarkable is the sauropod that is in a cave drawing in Utah, which was dated round about 1000 AD. The Neanderthals also had trinkets or containers with relief sort of pictures of dinosaurs as we know them from Jurassic Park, if I may say that. And then in the center, we have this dinosaur with the plates on the back, which we also know very well from Jurassic Park and Hollywood productions like that, but also from fossil findings, etc. Now, the amazing thing of this one is that it was chiseled out of rock, where the palace, or whatever it is at Angkor, was built in 1186. Now we have depictions of the 1100s in different areas, in other words, Britain as well as Angkor in, I think it is in Cambodia, and we have it in a French chateau, and in Utah on the American continent. And here on the right side, we have the Ica stones, which depict dinosaurs quite a bit, but I discovered also there's a lot of controversy about this, and some people suggest that the whole Ica stones business is really fake. Now that may be so, and then you must just ignore this picture. I'm not an expert on the archaeological side of all this. But then you find these items like in the center at the bottom, which looks very much like a Ceratosaurus. And we don't know, is it a toy? Is it a fake? Is it real? From when? And where was it made? I couldn't find that out. What I'm just saying is that people knew about dinosaurs long before they knew about fossils. And from a fossil, you cannot get these pretty accurate pictures that people had on brass plates, on trinkets from the Neanderthals, as well as French chateaus and in Cambodia. So that's just something to remember here. But one thing that I find even more interesting is this. Biological life is really not simple. Life is either an almost commonplace manifestation of matter, given certain conditions, of course, or it is an absolute miracle. In the light of Genesis 1, think of homology. Many times we are told that because a mouse has 4 legs and a tail, it is somehow similar to some other animal that also has 4 legs and a tail. I'm on purpose making this very simple. But homology is not always the common base. We could say that all dog types look the same. And yes, there it is true that the homology shows us that they're all from the same species, from physical appearance. But we cannot say that all the horses came from dogs, came from cats, came from mice, or something like that. And that is really very often the case when you go to museums. They have different animals, and they say this is really the ancestor of this one and that one and that one. But I tell you what, there is a lot of conjecture in that, and it is based on physical appearance. Then we get other things, of course, in the light of Genesis 1. If you think human beings can really count, they also have different vision to us. An eagle sees the world differently to a dog, to a human being, to a bee. So the type of vision we have, the type of eyes we have is different. Our hearing is different. Our sense of smell is different. And then when we get to the fossils and geology, we must think of the sediment layers, and we see that fossils and geology and the biological sciences use the word evolution quite often. And they want us to believe that it all evolved over millions of years, even the sediment layers. And in today's modern geology, there is a lot of doubt on that. Because we have seen in an explosion like Mount St. Helens in the state of Washington in the United States, how a miniature Grand Canyon can be created in a couple of hours. And the sediment layers that are visible there did not take millions of years. If we think about it, dinosaurs are always put very far back in deep time. And we have birds and dogs, and the birds apparently came from dinosaurs, etc. And we will look at that a little bit later and find out that is not very rational. And dogs, all dogs, came from one pair of wolves. But there's another thing that we will cover or will investigate a bit more in detail, and that is the complexity and design in living beings, and that the role of randomness in this story is actually quite preposterous. It doesn't matter who you are, how clever you are, how many degrees you have, but it is just from a reasonable, logical, rational point of view, it is impossible if the complexity and design of living beings is now pushed back to randomness. So evolution as origin or creation as origin, that's really the question. Those are the only shows in town. You either evolved randomly or there was a creator involved. All right. The other one is the timeline. Was it billions of years, thousands of years? We can't even imagine 10,000 years. Never mind millions of years. Where does all this evolution thing come from? Well, Charles Darwin, a man in the 1800s, mid-1800s in the UK, wrote a book. Of course, there's much more behind it, but he wrote the book on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life in 1859. It did not contain the word evolution, that's interesting, and from the 6th edition the book title was changed on the origination of species by development from earlier forms, not by special creation. That little drawing on the side here looks like a doodling effort of Charles Darwin, and yes, it is true that sometimes great ideas are just sort of sketched on a serviette, as it were. This one was probably the origin of the whole theory of evolution. Now, the main conclusion of this book is really man is descended from some less organized form. We will show later that this has never been observed, and it really goes against the laws of physics, but more about that a little later. So gradual changes within species and adaptation to the environment provide different colors and sizes of these animals and possibly beaks or whatever, and that is what Darwin discovered at the Galapagos Islands. And there were also other characteristics used in the breeding of plant and animals for centuries already, and that will eventually result in new species. That's true, but not new kinds. If you, goal-driven, change the genetics of a plant or an animal, be it chickens or be it peas or beans, then you're not creating new chickens, new kinds, that is something else. You are just creating new species of chickens or peas. So these natural processes, we can produce new species. But in Darwin's world, that meant new kinds without limitation. And of course, this was a very revolutionary idea 200 years ago, but there was no hard fact evidence, no observations, and biologically completely unfounded. Now, we're not blaming Charles Darwin maybe for that, because the science of his day considered even a cell as just a blob, and nobody knew what was inside there. However, today, with insight into genetics, the hypothesis of Charles Darwin's evolution is totally unsustainable. Essentially, what the theory of evolution says is there is no place for a creator God in this molecules to man scenario. We can explain everything, or simply put, from goo via the zoo to you. That sounds all very sexy, but that is not how it happened. Definitely not. Let's have a look at some detail here. Now, the created kinds that in the quote, I said you should hear it very clearly that the word kinds was used over and over. In Hebrew, that means bara min, which is not the same as species. It means kinds. There's the horse kind. And man-made classification systems are not always very consistent. This genus and species and families are not consistent. But fixity of kinds is a given. We'll get into that in a moment as well. But not fixity of species. What I mean by that is species can evolve in the word sense of adaptation, but they stay what they are in terms of kinds. So wolves can change into dogs with very careful breeding and selection, but it sits in the chromosomes that we can see that dogs and wolves are actually the same. The chromosomes here make the difference, not the homology and not even the abilities, because many of them are different anyway between wolves and dogs. But the basic model was based on this doodling tree, I would say. The tree of evolution morphology became a very, very popular concept. Now, if you believe in a creator, this picture of the tree is only applicable in the top part. Let me show you. Here we've got a single origin right at the bottom, right? And over time, this branched off in all sorts of directions. But when you had a creator, what the creator did is, or at least what looks like today, the creator did is, he created all these different animals and kinds, and there are, of course, changes within the kinds that became species. But you can see that each kind has its own core, its own beginning. So Darwin's idea was this tree of life, which continuously branches out. And it could look like that if you ignore that God created each kind separately. But you see, if you don't believe in a God, then the left side picture is no good for you. The right side picture is the one you want to believe, Darwin's idea. The evidence for birds being descended from dinos is also one of those things. You know, if you just look at something that, this is a photograph out of a museum. Okay, in this museum, there is an unknown common ancestor for all these dinosaurs, and the birds are part of it. This is all based on certain well-preserved fossils that they have found over the years, over the decades actually, and they have found Tyrannosaurus, sauropods, armored plant eaters, Stegosaurus. There are all these names, but when you look at the branches, they have absolutely no evidence where these ancestors of each one of these dinosaurs actually came from. So 0 plus 0 branching off into 0, 0, 0. In the end, we have a list of animals. They are all dinosaurs. And I would say these dinosaurs, in the definition of kinds and species, the dinosaur species all originated in one dinosaur kind. Ah, you say, now we got you, because how did these dinosaurs ever get onto the ark, if that is true? Well, it's actually not as difficult as what you think, because dinosaurs also start little, and if you have young animals on the ark, you easily get them in. And remember, you only need one pair of original dinosaurs, and the different species can form later. But the main point I really want to make here is there are 200,000 fossils of birds, and they're all the same kind in terms of bird kind. But let's have a look at this one. If we were today to find two skulls of two animals that look like this, the Canis familiaris, then we would say they're different animals, or at least different species of the same animal. But here we are talking of dogs. And there are hundreds of types of dogs and different head bones, but they're all one species. All right, the dogs. But they again came from the wolves, and there's only one wolf kind. And look what we get out of it. By selective breeding, you can get all these. Can they breed with each other? Yes, mostly you could, but there are some other things that are just going against the grain of rationality and reasonableness. Description of how animals started from the Cambrian right up to the Quaternary, where we are meant to be, and all the animals in between. Now that is displayed almost everywhere, in books and so on. And many of these animals are total conjecture and artistic renderings that get their input, because they're artists, they get their input from the paleontologists. Now look at this one. This Pachycetus, apparently there are some fossils on that, but the Elomeryx is one that is conjectured. And you see the homology and how it changes. And why is it changing like this? To get to a whale. Now here's the big, big secret. The best evidence for evolution yet is a little bit of fossil material from this one highlighted there. I can never pronounce these names. Okay. It still seems to have 4 legs. It's got a tail. It's got a crocodile-like sort of mouth. But this is what we really have. This top one was never found. The one Ambulocetus, or whatever it is, the one that is pictured there, was also never found and is a conjecture. The one with the 4 crosses, they found a couple of bones of this one, but they never found any of the flippers or legs or whatever it might have been, and they never found any tail bones. But the whole animal is drawn like this, and yet it was only a simple small piece of bone. You can already see it is a pretty long shot to go from the top one to the bottom one, and that's really what I want to say. So now we see the modern whale today. And the modern whale is derived from something that is very questionable at the top, to the next one, to the next one. Then we've got a fossil that is reasonably intact. We have no idea if it is connected to the top 3. And then that is going to somehow go to the whales. Well, if that is the best evidence yet, there is not much. So what's left? Well, fossils versus living. We can look at this, for example. Whenever we find a human or ape-like fossil, especially a skull, immediately it gets put into this tree, because the sort of idea is that the apes evolved and later became sort of half human and then human. And so in the middle at the top there, that's where you are, and me. And somewhere in here are the Neanderthals. There are all sorts of groups, but the names of these groupings and the fossils that have been allocated to these groups are very much guesses, because they are not sure if this is halfway to a man, or if it is still ape, or if it is human. But by today, because of genetics and other things that we can discern better, we find that all these modern discoveries, the skulls are either apes or they are humans. We still haven't found a missing link. And also we haven't found anything that indicates that the ape has changed into a human being. It needs a lot more to make them the same, and the biggest obstacle today is really the DNA. The DNA. There's often the saying, but apes are 98% the same DNA as human beings. Well, that isn't quite true. It depends what you're looking at the DNA, and we might go into that in the next presentation, but it's not as easy as that. So we have human beings and we have apes, but the idea that gets propagated all the time is that we evolved like this. And in the age of genetics and DNA, it's looking less and less likely that this theory can still hold. So, the problem isn't scantiness of fossils, but that they don't fit the evolutionary theory any longer. A newly discovered skull gets a new name, and then the fight starts. Is it an ape or is it human? And the one or the other group wins. The gaps will still be there, but now we have another skull in another part of the tree, or we start off a new branch in the tree. And the classifications seem to be pretty imaginative and totally arbitrary. I saw that very clearly by listening to a scientific talk of the Homo naledi story, which is very recent, and the experts there were fighting over details, and many people said these are pure apes, others said they are pure human. Maybe it's very simple. Maybe apes are apes and humans are humans, and there is no humanoid ape to be found anywhere. Fossils should indicate countless stages of transition. There are, after all, 50 to 200 years of research now and finding fossils. And we still haven't found any transition fossil. Invention of a punctuated equilibrium, because we cannot explain, or rather the evolutionists cannot explain, why many of the what we call created kinds suddenly appear in the sediments, and it doesn't work anymore, again, with genetics and DNA. And the famous Cambrian explosion that, according to geological timescales, happened 600 million years ago, is a real headache now, because all existing and even some extinct life forms, starting from trilobites to sponges to worms, jellyfish, crustaceans, and complex vertebrates, appear without any ancestry. According to evolutionists, this happened in the evolutionary blink of only 5 million years. Now that's a pretty good guess too, is it? 5 million years? I mean, who can query it if it's 10 million years, 5 million years, or 10,000 years? If, however, these creatures were created in one fell swoop, we would find the evidence of complex, fully formed specimens in the fossil record. But they are complex, fully formed specimens. And that's what we find, of course, in all the fossil over the last, in all the fossil records over the last 50 to 200 years. So why do people cling to this theory? Well, the answer is relatively simple. It depends on your own worldview, your perspective, your paradigm, and it depends also, to a large extent, on volition. And volition is that you already decided what is true, and you have a willful decision that you make, and you see what can all fit in there. And to an extent, a creationist would be just as prone to this as an atheist. But the point is, there's a prior commitment to exclusive materialism in the atheistic humanist world, and it will not allow an alternative view. And it could be that the alternative view has better, more rational, more reasonable evidence than materialism has. For example, Harvard geneticist Richard Lewontin said materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow the divine a foot in the door. Now that's quite a statement, and that's also a statement of intent. In other words, materialism is the only show in town. We will not tolerate any other theory. Now, if a creator is a non-starter, then evolution is the only show in town. Okay? No room for any other ideas. And here's another evolutionist, L.T. Moore of the University of Chicago said, "Our faith in evolution depends on our reluctance," that's volition, "to accept the antagonistic doctrine of special creation." Now, I cannot see anything antagonistic doctrine in there. It is just another paradigm. Why is it excluded right away? If the theory of evolution again cannot be proven from the facts, then it can only be promoted as dogma. And you might remember when I said real operational science depends on observation, a hypothesis. If the hypothesis proves through experimentation that it is always true and it cannot be falsified, we can talk of a theory. And that is how most laws of physics actually have been established. But here we can only say, well, evolution is dogma. You could say, well, creationism is dogma. True, but then you must see what is the evidence and what is most likely to be true, because operational science is always accurate and can be modeled and can be experimented. But historical science, nobody can repeat history. But let me get closer to something that is more in my own domain. Design is simply the purposeful arrangement of parts. And the parts are either man-made or the parts are found in nature, out of wood, rock, or whatever the material might be. But a purpose is presupposed for a design. A design means you're designing something for a purpose. And purpose implies planning and intelligence. Now, life on Earth at its most fundamental level, in its most critical components, is surely the product of some intelligent activity. Just imagine, it takes thousands and tens of thousands of very smart scientific people to analyze what is there already, what is prescribed, because it is there already. And now we, as good scientists, are trying to figure out why it is the way it is and how it came to be like that. And then we discover amazing, amazing designs for amazing purposes too. Indeed, we can say, for the extreme fine-tuning of all the created beings, a supernatural intelligence is undeniable. Let me go to engineering and make an analogy here. Let me ask you, how many car components do you think are in a car or in an aeroplane? Well, I've done the homework for you already. Between 30,000 and 70,000 pieces make up a modern car. The average Boeing 747 or Airbus 380 consists of 6 to 7 million components. Now that's a lot. So there's our car, there's our aeroplane. Well, the first question I must ask you is, did this just happen? Was this just a random accident? Because the materials all come from the earth. We found them here somewhere, the steel, the aluminium, the titanium, whatever it might be, the glass, okay. But we reworked it and then we purposefully designed something. And to design it properly, you have to give a lot of attention to detailed design. Let me illustrate. This is not a system. This is a heap of scrap. Yes, those appear to be parts of a motor car, but that is not a functional motor car. Would you agree? We don't know the history of all these parts. We don't know where they come from. So it's just a heap of scrap. Now let's say here's this car and we have all the components there lying on the floor. And you look at all these parts and you inspect them, every washer, every wheel, every hinge, every part of the engines, the gearbox, everything is there. And you've ordered this car from a catalog and they deliver it to you like this. Will you accept it as a car? Probably not. Because you were looking for this. You were not looking for that picture on the left. Yes, all the components are there, but they are not functionally, intelligently integrated to give us a functional car. So what had to be added to go from this heap of separate parts to an assembled motor car? What is it? We had to add intelligence. There had to be additional information on how to get all these pieces together with their right interfaces. Somebody had to make and design, sorry, the other way around. Somebody had to design and make all these parts, and they all had to be made with a specific purpose so as to fit in the end into this system called a functional motor car. And we need a lot of energy to do this, because it's a law of physics that if you do work, you need energy for it. So intelligence, knowledge, and energy is important for anything that you design and make for purpose. Let me give you one more example, which is really an amazing example. You all know caterpillars and you all know butterflies. If we look at the homology, it's amazing and actually unbelievable that a caterpillar can ever turn into a butterfly, because they're so different, so completely different. But this in-between stage, the chrysalis or chrysalis, is an important aspect of the transition from a caterpillar to a butterfly. They have taken MRI scans of chrysalis, and they had a look every single day how this caterpillar changes inside that cocoon into a butterfly. How does that happen? And they discovered a very, very interesting fact. The caterpillar dissolves completely except for a couple of little kernels, molecular focal points almost, where all the internal organs of the caterpillar get destroyed. But remember, this thing is still alive somehow, and turns slowly into the organs that are required for a butterfly. So we are going from the caterpillar to the butterfly over a certain time by dissolving all the internal organs and rebuilding new organs with the same content. That is almost like taking a Model T Ford and converting it to a modern helicopter. That cannot be done without intent, without knowledge, without purpose, without good design. As an engineer, I can tell you, you can disassemble the Ford and it will never become a helicopter. In fact, you say, well, that's unfair because a helicopter looks modern. Model T Ford is pretty old. You can take a Tesla if you like. It will not convert into a helicopter like this without intent, without intelligence, without purpose, without design, with a goal. But I'm an aeronautical engineer, so I'm very, very interested in bird flight and flight in general. Let's just take this example here. You have noticed that Boeings and Airbus have got these winglets on the tips of their wings these days. They've got flaps, they got leading edge slats, they got all sorts of things to help them fly cheaper, further, etc. And also in the materials. So if you look at the birds, let's have a look at this eagle, for example. The eagle has winglets. Do you see that? So in a way, you could say God anticipated all these physical laws because he made them and incorporated them in his design of eagles and of other birds. And even the bone structure being hollow is very much like the structural parts of this Boeing 737 that you see there at the bottom right. In fact, there's more. There are things like the leading edge slats, which the birds also have. They use it when they come into land. So, next week's topic is really the creation of mankind. Now, God, Elohim again, said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So note here, already God said, with purpose, this man, we make him in our image, in other words, after our likeness. That doesn't make us God. It's just some attributes are the same. And this man will have dominion over all the fish and the birds and livestock and everything that's on the earth. And so God created man in God's image. In the image of God he created him, male and female. The female came later, but there's a good reason for that too. It's part of design, okay? And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the sea, the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So, in a way, mankind has already been given the job and the responsibility, because what God created is all his, right? And it is his to give to somebody else. And God created all these other things, and he passes on the responsibility of keeping them to mankind. Romans 1:20 says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. So men are without excuse." And in a very, very simple way, I suppose, I tried to just show you, if we look at some of the complexity of design and development, if we look at the variety of animals on this planet, if we look at the whole story of Genesis 1, how it came about, it actually makes much more sense to believe that than to believe the conjecture of the materialist or the atheist. Remember, what they said is we must exclude the divine, definitely. And the thing is, if you do that, you are already excluding a major cause of how creation started, because you don't want to hear it, you don't want to see it, you don't want to see the evidence for it by volition. So I want to thank you for listening to this one. I used to fly gyrocopters for a long time, and this is not a gyrosaurus, but it is a designed flying machine. It is known as a gyrocopter. But my main point in all this is, and you say, well, obviously it is not randomly, it didn't just happen randomly. It too required intent, intelligence, purpose, and a systematic design activity. And we see that in nature everywhere. But it seems to me that people are blind to it. And so Romans 1:20 reminds us that we should look a bit closer, seek the truth, explore deeper, and try and understand. For God says in his word, people are without excuse. Thank you again.